Joining us on the line is my friend Bishop Robert Barron, Bishop of the Diocese of Winona, Rochester in Minnesota, founder of Word on Fire Catholic Ministries. He's a #1 Amazon bestselling author. He's published numerous books, essays, and articles on theology, and his newest book is called This Is My Body, A Call to Eucharistic Revival. Bishop, thanks so much for joining the show.
Ben, thank you for having me.
You bet. So let's talk about the state of Catholicism right now. So Catholicism seems to be experiencing something similar to what Judaism is experiencing, what Protestantism is experiencing, which is the abstraction of the actual religion into nothingness by a large percentage of its supposed adherents. It's really a major problem inside sort of mainstream religions that many of the people who purport to be members of the faith are overtly sort of dissociating from core elements of the faith and then abstracting them into sort of meaningless phraseology.
No, quite right. And, if I put my philosopher's hat on for a second, go right back to Immanuel Kant in the 18th century, the reduction of religion to ethics. So that was a typical move of the modern philosophers. Get rid of dogma, get rid of history. Jesus, we don't even know if he existed for sure. Bracket all that. What it really comes down to, Kant said, is ethics, being a ethically upright person. When I was coming of age in the Catholic Church, I think religion was often distilled into the language of social justice. You were a good Catholic if you were for, civil rights, you were for concern for the poor, et cetera. Well, that's a sort of popular Kantianism, and it has invaded, as you say, all the major religions because modernity, so this philosophical point of view coming out of Kant and Descartes and Hegel and Marx and many others, has infected all of us. And I think it is time for us religious people to say, no, there's a lot more to religion than simply a very abstracted version of ethics.
One of the things that I think has happened here, Bishop, and it really is an amazing thing, is that a lot of religious people have come down on the wrong side of what we call the Erythro problem. So if you go back to Plato, the Erythro problem is basically, is God above morality or is morality above God? And what you're talking about here is that what religious people have done, what the Catholic Church has been amazing at doing over the course of the last couple thousand years, is teaching that the morality of God is reflected in the natural law, that the natural law is a reflection and it gives us an ability to understand some parts, not all, but large parts of what God is doing because we have a mind created by God, able to mirror the natural universe in a way that God wants us to mirror it. But that does not suggest, the natural law, that we are now greater than God or that we're capable of overcoming the morality of God. It's our attempt to understand morality that was imposed by a higher power. And so we've now taken that and we've reversed the polarity. And the idea is that if we deem something to be immoral and the Bible says, no, it is moral, or the opposite, well, then God has to be answerable to our morality, which of course makes idols of ourselves.
Right. I think when I was a philosophy student years ago, Philosophy 101, the first Platonic dialogue I read was the Euthyphro. So that famous problem that you outlined. And the answer, of course, in our great theologians, you simply cut the Gordian knot of the Euthyphro problem. Is the ground of morality is the very being of God. So morality doesn't hover above God in some determining way, nor is it simply an arbitrary decision of God, but it's in line with the very structure of God's manner of being. And then, as you say, that's reflected in the natural law that we can discern, and also in the very structures of our minds and moral imaginations. So it's a great unity there. That gets split apart. Plato suggests a problem with the Euthyphro thing, but I think we can overcome that rather easily. But the recovery of the natural law tradition, I think you're quite right, is key to the reviving of a lot of these religious and philosophical traditions that are placed in danger today. So morality is becoming largely an arbitrary matter of my own feelings, my own private decisions. And we simply tolerate each other's subjective determinations. But see, when you talk about the nature of God, you talk about the natural law, we're talking about things that draw us together. See, that to me is the irony, is the more we emphasize subjective morality, the more divided we are, the more violent we become because we simply stand against each other. But when you talk about the natural law and its groundedness in God, we find the very things that can bring us together. That is something all the religions, I think, have to focus on.
Yeah, Bishop, this is something that's sort of amazing to think about, is how many of our assumptions about sort of Kantian philosophy are rooted in the fumes of religion. When you read Locke, you have to understand that Locke is speaking against a backdrop of a religious society that believes in Judeo-Christian principles. When you read Kant, you have to understand that what he's trying to do is he's actually trying to backfill Christian morality into a secular world. That's what he's attempting to do. But the problem is that once the fumes run out, once the religion goes away, everything becomes incredibly subjective very quickly. And so all of those arguments tend to devolve into exactly the sort of subjectivism you're talking about. And that brings us back to what you're talking about in your new book, This Is My Body, a Call to Eucharistic Revival. Now, obviously, Judaism doesn't have anything that is directly parallel to the Eucharist, but it does have the idea that you must involve yourself in rituals that are seemingly bizarre, rituals that you don't fully understand, because that is a recognition that there is a law that is above you, that is not coming out of the center of your own head, that is not subject to your own sort of personal interpretation of the situation.
No, quite right. And I'll go back to your opening comment about Kant, because you're right. The second form of the categorical imperative, which is the ground of Kantian morality, is simply a form of the golden rule. So Kant, never treat another human being simply as a means, but only as an end. Well, he gets that, of course, from the biblical tradition, and he is trying to ground it. The problem was the reductionism of all religion to ethics. To your second point, absolutely right. Again, when I was coming of age, there was a tendency to de-emphasize ritualism within the Catholic Church, to bring to the fore ethics, especially social ethics. But you're right, without the rituals that connect us in a visceral and embodied way to God and to the reality of God, the ethics are going to run out of steam, and they will devolve into mere subjectivism. It's the old cut flowers principle. You cut flowers and you put them in a vase, they'll be presentable for a time. What's happened is we've taken the ethical principles of the Judeo-Christian tradition, we've cut them off from their doctrinal and ritual roots, and then we're surprised now that they're fading away. We shouldn't be surprised. Unless you ground those things in something like an embodied ritualism, we'll lose them.
So let's talk about the Eucharist, or the meaning of, so in Judaism, the Eucharist obviously is connected to sort of Judaic roots in terms of sacrifice, the system in Hebrew of korbanot. Why don't you talk about what exactly the Eucharist is for people who don't understand it from the Catholic perspective?
Look at maybe two sides, and both very much grounded in Judaism, is the Lord God wants to feed his people with his own life. So, eat from all the trees in the garden except one. And we put such stress on the one prohibition, we often overlook the great permission. Eat from all the trees. Think of the Passover meal. Think of the manna coming from heaven. In all these ways that the Lord wants to feed his people. How central to Jesus was this theme? Think of his open table fellowship, the scholars call it, that he was open to, saints and sinners and tax collectors and prostitutes, and to come to the table. And it was, in our understanding, that's the God of Israel inviting his people to a meal. And then, of course, his life comes to a climax at the Last Supper. Take this and eat, this is my body. Take this and drink, this is my blood. And of course, that's temple language, that's sacrificial language, the body offered for you, blood poured out for you, linking it thereby to the cross, which we see as the culmination of the temple worship of Israel. So the God of Israel given now perfect worship on the cross. Think even of the blood and water flowing from the side of Jesus. We've, I think, probably largely lost the sense of that, but no first century Jew would have missed water coming from the side of Jesus. Well, that's Ezekiel's prophecy that when the temple is restored, water would come from its side for the renewal of the world. Those are all Eucharistic themes for us, of the meal, of the sacrifice, the life-giving quality of the God of Israel. And we're invited to eat and drink this reality. That's the Eucharist. I wrote that book because there's a Eucharistic revival going on. The American bishops called for this because a loss of the sense of the meaning of the Eucharist. And see, I think here you and I find such common ground because when you divorce the Eucharist from its very deep Jewish roots, that's when you start to misunderstand it as simply a vague symbol, or it's a symbol of our coming together as a family. And, fine, but the deepest reality is in the Jewish roots of Catholicism. How wonderful, too, the Eucharist surrounded by altar, by priesthood, by sacrifice, by incense and candles, and all the kind of accoutrement of temple worship, where the Protestant tradition tended to eschew much of that. The Catholic tradition took it in and celebrates it. So I think all of that is of a piece when talking about the Eucharist.
When we talk about rituals like the Eucharist, and obviously I'm an Orthodox Jew, so this is not my view of religion, but the Eucharist, where the common roots lie in terms of, a belief in the Old Testament, belief in prophecy, and also a belief in the power of ritual. This is something, as we've been discussing this whole time, that really is extraordinarily necessary, not only because it allows for skin in the game, as Nassim Nicholas Taleb may put it. The idea that when you are demonstrating fealty to a religion or to a group, that it requires skin in the game. You're going to have to show that you actually believe in a thing that other people don't necessarily believe in. You're going to do a thing that maybe is not even understandable completely to you because you're showing that you have fealty to the thing. That's really, really important, obviously. But again, it goes back to this idea that if you believe in tradition, if something has been handed down for thousands of years, then maybe that's a thing of value. And when you lose that, when you start thinking, I don't understand it, so I'm just not going to do it, the next thing that happens is that everything that you've inherited starts to go by the wayside. This is why I've said that I really believe that the single most important commandment in the Bible is just a Shapiro belief, not necessarily a fully Jewish or Christian belief, but it's the single most important, in my view, rule in the Bible, in the Ten Commandments, is respect your father and mother. Because if your father and mother are a reflection of the divine in some way, which we do believe, where we believe that God and your parents are partners in the creating of you, respecting your father and mother and bringing down a tradition, bringing down that line. If you respect the tradition, then you're likely to imbibe from that pool of wisdom. And if you don't respect the tradition, you're likely to drown in the chaos of the waters.
Right. And that's a classic Catholic reading, too. You find in Thomas Aquinas that command has to do not just with your biological parents, but with all authority figures, stretching back. I'll say a word, too, about the body. The name of my book is This Is My Body, the embodied quality of religion. Ancient Gnosticism drove body and soul apart. So the body was less important. The soul was all important. Escaping from the body and its restrictions was a desideratum. Well, that's revived in modernity, too. Look at it in Descartes. Look in the dualism of Kant, etc. And the privileging of the interior over the exterior, the spiritual over the bodily. And I think that's rampant today. And think of all the transgender ideology and where the real me is buried deep down in there somewhere. And the body is just there for me to ignore, manipulate, change, intervene surgically upon, etc. Well, see, all that's repugnant to a clear sense of creation. And that we're made body and soul in the image and likeness of God. That I'm an integral unit. I'm not a soul hiding or trapped in a body. And that comes through a ritual consciousness, because the rituals are not just psychic events or interior events. They involve the body. I remember my parents, when I was a little kid, bringing me into church, saying, okay, now you genuflect before you enter the pew, because there's the tabernacle that contains the body of Jesus. Well, that's something in my body, It's still in my body. I was taught that ritual gesture. When you eschew ritual, the body gets marginalized. And when the body gets marginalized, religion becomes a very abstract endeavor. And then eventually it'll fade away. There's the cut flowers thing. When my interior, my mind is cut off from my body, I fall apart. So I would go from Gnosticism to the modern philosophers to a lot of what you see today in the public conversation.
Well, again, the book is This Is My Body, A Call to Eucharistic Revival. The author is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop, really appreciate the time. Wonderful conversation. Great to see you.
Ratzinger emerges as one of the great defenders of reason, that man's mind can know certain things with certitude. I think that is perhaps his most enduring legacy in terms of the wider culture. One of the greatest figures of our time, one of the most consequential churchmen of the last 100 years has died. Pope Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger. He was one of the most balanced and nuanced and stabilizing figures in the life of the church, even though a lot of his critics would characterize him as a fire-breathing conservative. He really was anything but. He leaves an extraordinary legacy to both church and the wider society. There's so much we could say about him. In this brief tribute, I'll just mention a few simple things. The first is, and I think it's the most important thing to know about Joseph Ratzinger, that the central event of his life was the Second Vatican Council. He's a very young man, only about 35, when he was tapped to be a peritus, or a theological expert, by Cardinal Frings of Cologne. And in that capacity, he goes to Rome in 1962. He's there for all the sessions of the council. And despite his youth, he plays an outsized role at Vatican II, contributing mightily to the writing of many of the key documents, and then explaining the council to many of those who were in Rome and in the wider society. Here's the interesting thing. When he was at Vatican II, he would have been identified as one of the liberals, if you want, along with people like Rahner and Skilebex and Kung and others. And he was, calling for reform in the life of the church. And in that capacity, he was standing athwart conservatives who were resisting that renewal. But then, very shortly after the council, he begins to stand against Catholic progressivism that was trying to go beyond the text of the council, that was claiming itself as a separate magisterium. He saw that as equally problematic. And so the liberal of the mid-1960s becomes the conservative by the mid-1970s. But as Ratzinger himself, I think, very credibly said, his own views hadn't changed at all. And see, I think it's key to understanding his life and his writings. He was a man of the council. He was instrumental in the shaping of the conciliar documents, and he held off critics of both the left and the right and held to the integrity of those great documents. Someone who was a very like mind was Karol Wojtyła, who was the Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow. Ratzinger would have known him from the council, but of course he came into closer contact with him during the conclaves of 1978. Well, when Karol Wojtyła becomes Pope John Paul II, he taps Ratzinger as his chief doctrinal officer. And I think, again, the way to understand the 25 years he spent with John Paul II in that very important capacity was to defend and give a proper interpretation to the Second Vatican Council. You can see it, by the way, very clearly in the Catechism of 1992, which is filled with the language and elan and spirit of Vatican II, and holds off both a hyper-conservatism and a hyper-liberalism. So Ratzinger, a man of the Second Vatican Council. Here's a second basic thing about him, that he was, it might seem a paradox, but he was a great man of reason. Now, I say a paradox because it's very clear he was a man of faith. As a priest, as a theologian, as a professor, as a bishop, as pope, he's obviously a man of the Bible, the church fathers, a man of faith. But see, here's the paradox. Precisely because of that, because he was a man of Christian faith, he was ipso facto a man of reason. Now, why? Because Christian faith declares that Jesus is not one figure among many, not just a great spiritual teacher among many, but rather the incarnation of the Logos, of the very reason of God, the Logos by which and through which God creates the world and imbues it with intelligibility. Well, see, what does that claim entail? It entails that any logical enterprise, science, philosophy, psychology, all the manifestations of culture in the measure that they reflect reason, are naturally attuned to Christianity, are natural conversation partners for Christianity. And so it's precisely as a man of Christian faith, he became a man of reason. And at a time when many of the supposed avatars of reason, I mean the leading philosophers and so on in the culture, were adopting nihilistic positions or completely relativistic positions, Ratzinger emerges as one of the great defenders of reason, that man's mind can know certain things with certitude. I think that is perhaps his most enduring legacy in terms of the wider culture, that he was a man of reason. Look how it enabled him to dialogue with some of the leading figures, even an atheist philosopher like Jürgen Habermas. I might mention in this context the famously controversial speech he gave at University of Regensburg when he was Pope. And, it caused controversy because he cited a Islamic or a critique of Islam from the Middle Ages. But see, people miss the point of that talk, and it was just the one that I made, that Christianity's option for logos over mythos, logic or philosophy rather than mythology, the option for logos over sheer will, enabled Christianity to enter into vibrant dialogue with the wider culture. And that was a key theme for Joseph Ratzinger. Here's just the last thing I want to reflect on. That's his relationship to the Lord Jesus Christ. He's quoted often, and it's very reflective of his mind, that Christianity is not a philosophy, it's not an ideology, it's not primarily a system of ideas, but rather it's a relationship to a person. Christianity is a relationship to the living Christ. And I think it's fair to say anyone that knew him knew that he lived out of that relationship. He lived out of that friendship. I just met him very briefly one time, but I do have a personal memory from the time I was a visiting scholar in Rome in 2007. So I was there for an extended period. I made it a point. I don't think I missed many, if any of them. I went down every Wednesday to St. Peter's Square when Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, would give a general audience. And he would pray with the people and so on, but he also gave about a 25-minute talk on some aspect of theology or the spiritual life or one of the great figures of the tradition. And, his erudition and his intelligence and his command of languages was on clear display. But what was especially on display, I thought, in his gestures and his whole way of being and his manner of presenting himself, was that he was in love with the Lord. That he was not just an academic trading in ideas, but he was someone who loved the Lord Jesus Christ. Something else on a more personal level, again, his enemies called them their Panzer Cardinal, the Panzer tanks of the Second World War, or he was God's Rottweiler. Well, anyone that knew him, I didn't know him well personally, but I knew a lot of people who did know him. They just would sort of smile and shake their heads at that, because the real Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, was this very kind, very gentle, very soft-spoken academic, known above all for his goodness and his kindness. Many of the bishops who would cycle through Rome for the ad limina visits, when you go to see the Pope, but then during those visits, you also have conversations with the curial leaders. And almost to a person, they would say that during those years, the most impressive figure they dealt with was Joseph Ratzinger. His capacity to listen to everyone around the table and then to synthesize what they said in a very generous and charitable way. That's what struck them about, God's Rottweiler. I heard a story that typically during those years, at the end of a long day of work, what he loved most to do was to go to one of the local bookstores, and they circle the Vatican there, pick up the latest tome of theology, and then go to one of his favorite little restaurants and sit in the corner by himself and read and order dinner. And I think that's, of course, he was an introvert. He was an academic, and that's what he loved to do. I think, too, that the last 10 years or so of his life, when he lived in kind of isolation and retreat at the Vatican, it's probably the way Joseph Ratzinger really wanted to live most of his life as a man of thought and prayer and reading and writing. But he was thrust by affairs and by history and by God's grace into a public role. And, thank God for it, because, as I say, he played this extremely influential, extremely stabilizing role in the life of the church. He blessed us in 1,000 ways. And so as he passes from this world to the next, I would make bold to speak on behalf of the church and to say thank you to Joseph Ratzinger. Thank you to Pope Benedict XVI.
Peace be with you. Friends, the gospel for today is that wonderful and familiar story of Martha and Mary. But the church sets us up for this in a really interesting way by giving us a first reading from the book of Genesis, where in chapter 18, it's this very mysterious story of Abraham being visited by three guests. But listen to how this thing begins, how strange this is. The Lord appeared to Abraham. So this is a theophany. This is an appearance of God. The Lord appeared by the terebinth of Mamre as he sat in the entrance of his tent while the day was growing hot. Looking up, what did Abraham see? He saw three men standing nearby. Well, how can a Christian not be rather fascinated by this? It's being described as a theophany, an appearance of God, the God of Israel. And yet he appears as three figures. You know that great icon that's painted by Rublev, the Russian artist, and it's of the Trinity, we always say, but it's actually a picture of these three visitors of Abraham who are recognized as a kind of foreshadowing of the Trinitarian revelation of the Father, Son, and Spirit. And listen to this interesting detail. When he saw them, this is Abraham, ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them, and bowing down to the ground, he said, "Sir, if I may ask a favor." So it says he bowed down to them, the three of them, but then he addresses them as sir, as one. Interesting, at the very least, this play of the one and the three, which we Christians recognize. But here's the point I want to make. Once he understands this is a theophany, an appearance of God, what does he do? Well, he gives into this flurry of hospitality. So he serves them himself, and he has the fatted calf killed, and he arranges for drinks and for food, and then he waits on them himself. And you say, on the one hand, yeah, it's a beautiful picture of Middle Eastern hospitality. It's interesting about that, too, that in a rather severe country, where a traveler coming across a habitation, this might be a matter of life and death. He's been crossing a desert. That it's not just a matter of, let me give you a few little things to munch on. This might be a matter of life and death. So they showed great hospitality, beautifully. But a deeper spiritual point's going on. Once you know you're dealing with God, he deserves all of your attention. Your life is about him. All your thoughts, all your moves, all your actions, they're about him. They're focused and centered on him. It's the priority given to God in life. That's what we're meant to see here. The unicity of Abraham's attention, the clarity of his prioritization. There's no competition here. He's not saying, look, let me take care of a few other things before I get to the three of you. No. He's all about them. Not, let me have my servants do that for me. No. He will do it himself. He becomes a servant. Once he knows he's in the presence of God, you don't mess around with God. You don't make God secondary or tertiary in your life. No. He is the primary source of your attention. Okay, with that in mind, I think it's really interesting how the church gives us this story. We now turn to the familiar Martha and Mary. May I say, after years of preaching on this story, it's one that bugs people big time. I hear more complaints about the Martha-Mary story, usually from people who are defending Martha, that Jesus is being too tough on this lady. You know the story. Jesus comes to the home of Martha and Mary, the sisters of Lazarus. Martha is caught up, it says, in all the details of hospitality. Well, here's the first thing. We should know from the first story from Genesis, they're not complaining about hospitality. That's not the problem. Abraham was in a flurry of activity around hospitality. That's not really the problem. But Martha's given over to all this, and Mary sits attentively in the attitude of a disciple at the feet of Jesus. So that's the way you'd arrange yourself when a great master, a rabbi would come. You'd sit at his feet, you'd soak in his words. So there's busy Martha, and there's contemplative, focused Mary. And Martha famously complains, "Lord, tell her to help me. Here I am, taking care of this whole operation." Imagine when you're in the kitchen and you're fussing around and you're trying to get the dinner ready of all these people and the different demands, and you've got to time your cooking, et cetera, and you have to welcome him and you have to take care of that one. It's a lot. Anyone that's had a party knows how demanding that is. So Martha, understandably, complains about her sister who's just sitting around doing nothing, as far as she can tell. What's Jesus' response? "Martha, Martha." I love that, the double use of her name there. And it shows the intimacy, that these really were friends. It's lovely, I think, we often hear of Jesus' interlocutors or his disciples or his formal apostles and then his opponents, etc. But it's kind of rare to hear of his friends and to watch them in action. And that little line to me always gives it away. That's the way you talk to someone that you're intimate with, that you're friendly with. "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and worried about many things. There is need of only one thing." That's the key, it seems to me, to this story. It's not hospitality that's the problem. Again, Abraham was showing, frenetic hospitality. It's not like, oh, she's living the active life, and the active life is not as good as the contemplative life. I don't think that's getting to the heart of it. Again, listen, Martha, you are anxious and worried about many things. Like most of us. I mean, right now, I could tell you, I'm not going to bore you with it, but all the little things I'm worried about. Some aren't that little, but I mean, all the many things that I'm concerned about right now. My personal life and my professional life, my life as a bishop, this obligation, this pastoral opportunity, this person wants to talk to me, this person I talked to last week and I still haven't resolved the situation. All of that, the many things. You've got them too. You could tell me right now the many things that you're anxious and upset about. The problem is, if we focus on the many, we remain in a kind of splintered consciousness. This and that, and oh, there's that I'm worried about, and that reminds me of this, and then yesterday that happened, and then tomorrow that's going to happen. And I find myself now divided. Remember, one of the names of the devil is diabolos. Diabalein means to scatter apart, the many. It's a sign of the demonic, that I'm scattered. That's why you're anxious and worried. There's a need of only one thing, and that's what Mary has chosen. I love the Latin here. If you look at the Latin version of this gospel, that little phrase, the unum necessarium, the one thing necessary. Now, what is that? Is he saying don't worry about all these particular things? No. But listen now. Amidst all of them, underneath all of them, surrounding all of them, conditioning all of them, there's the one great concern, which is God. When my soul is focused entirely upon God, then I understand how the many things fit into my life. Then I've put in a secondary or tertiary position all those many particular things I'm worried about. But above them all, through them all, under them all, the one great thing, the unum necessarium, is God. Remember, I've said to you before, this is now a metaphysical point, that God is not one thing among many. So I'm worried about, my appointment tomorrow. I'm worried about this conversation I had yesterday. I'm worried about what's going to happen next week. I'm worried about God. I'm worried about my car. And well, no, that's not the way it works. It's all the little things, and then englobing all of them, under all of them, through all of them, is God, who's not one being among many, but the sheer act of being itself, that which gives rise to the totality of finite things, the creator of all things, ipsum esse in the language of Thomas Aquinas. God's very nature is to be. Therefore, when I'm focused upon God as the unum necessarium, then everything else in my life tends to fall into the right place. When I'm not focused on God, what happens to me? I become like Martha. I'm anxious and upset about all these many things because I haven't found the unum necessarium. She's chosen the better part. It doesn't mean she's chosen, the contemplative over the active. I wouldn't put it that way. That's too, I think, simplistic. Mary is focused on the one thing that really counts, which is the Lord. And then she sees the rest of her life in proper order and with proper prioritization. That lovely line from St. Augustine always comes to mind here. He says, Ama Deum et fac quod vis. That means love God and then do whatever you want. And it sounds like some kind of permissiveness. It's not that. If you love God, you found the unum necessarium. You are properly focused on God, then the rest of your life will fall into harmony. If you really love God, you will do the right thing. You'll find the right way to order and organize all the many things. But if you are not focused on God, then the many things tend to distract you, and you become anxious and upset. So take Martha there. Look, we're all sinners here. We all fall into this. When you find yourself beset by anxieties, ask a simple question. Have I found the unum necessarium? Is God clearly the center of my life? Okay, let me end with just a practical recommendation. The great Fulton Sheen made this really the center of his, I think, spiritual life. It was picked up actually a couple of generations after Sheen by a lot of the young kids that I taught at the seminary. I made it my practice, beginning so many years ago now. The Holy Hour. I begin every day. I get out of bed, the first thing I do, I go to my chapel and I spend an hour in prayer. I pray my office, which is my obligation as a priest, but I might pray the rosary, I might do the Jesus prayer, I might just sit in silence, I might just say, Lord, help me for 10 minutes. The point is, I begin the day consciously focused on the unum necessarium. And it has a way now of putting all of my anxious concerns in their right place. They don't disappear. I'm still worried and concerned about all those different things. But, now look, I'm a sinner. I don't always manage this perfectly. But I try to place it always within the context of the unum necessarium. That way, Martha and Mary can both come together. Think of Abraham. The minute he knew this was God, everything else fell away, and he was utterly devoted. Good. Live your life that way, and you'll find the many concerns tend to find their proper place. And God bless you.
Well, good afternoon to everybody. I am just delighted to see you all here. Listen, my heart is filled with so much gratitude today. To all of you for your presence here. To Archbishop Gomez, first of all, thank you for your presence. It means the world to me. But, you please. But also for this wonderful gift that you gave me of entrusting this most beautiful of the 5 regions to my pastoral care these last 6 years. As I stand here, Father Dan reminded me, I've said this for years. For my money, this is the single most beautiful spot in all of Southern California. When you've got, well, look, the sea in all its glory to the south, the mountains in all their glory to the north, and then right behind us, the facade of what's rightly called the Queen of the Missions. I don't know any place in Southern California more beautiful than this. And, this region, what a gift to me this has been as my sermon flies away. It's a sign of something. I got to figure this out. When I first came out here, yeah, there we go. It reminds me of the COVID period when masses outside. When I first came here, almost 7 years ago, I knew so little about this archdiocese. I'd been to LA a handful of times for talks and so on, and I've been to the Congress many times, but of course that's Anaheim, that's the Orange Diocese. And I had never really been up this way. But the day after my ordination as a bishop, so it would have been September the 9th, 2015, got in the car with 2 friends and we drove up to see my new place. And I remember coming over the Conejo Grade, and we all know there's kind of a sense of relief, isn't there, when you leave LA area behind, you come over the grade. And then as we moved up this way, these poor Midwestern eyes are used to seeing, flat plains and snowdrifts, and suddenly there's the ocean to the left, and look at the mountains to the right, and the palm trees, and I just fell in love with this region. I remember when we got off the 101 at Las Positas, and the mountain really opens up as you come off the highway, and I said to my friends, maybe someday the church will give me another assignment, but I will never be in a place as beautiful as this. And that's been true. I fell in love with it that day. I never fell out of love with it. I think of all these years, going from Guadalupe and Santa Maria down to Lompoc and Santa Ynez, down to Goleta here in Santa Barbara, Montecito, lovely Carpinteria, going over to Ventura, Oxnard, Camarillo, Simi Valley,
Thousand Oaks, Westlake Village, all of it. Loved all of it. Loved all of it. You know, as I rehearse that in my mind, I can't help but think of Deacon Chris Sander over here. Dear Deacon Chris, who's been my right-hand man these last 6 years, and who put how many miles on your car? I mean, probably 100,000 miles on his car, driving me around this region. But I'll tell you, it's a gift from God. I mean, because his goodness and kindness and dedication, intelligence, I mean, made those trips a joy for me. I mean, the wonderful hours we spent talking theology, politics, culture, everything was a great joy. And when I mentioned Deacon Chris, I can't help but mention 3 other people. I think I see her. There's Sophie Hernandez right here. Sophie, please. Sophie was my assistant when I first came out here, and she gave 25 years of her life to serving the bishops of this region, and retired maybe, 2 or 3 years after I got here. But with your kindness and your graciousness and your devotion to the Lord, I mean, you edified this whole region. I know a lot of the priests here remember, you know, your kindness. So Sophie, I want to pay tribute to you. And then the 2 other people, I think I see her back there, Sylvia Morgan. Sylvia, please. Sylvia began as my Spanish tutor. So when I came out here, I had a little bit of Spanish, but I knew I needed to really work on it. So she was recommended to me. And I'll say it to her credit, for the first year that I knew her, I didn't know she spoke English, because she just spoke Spanish to me for a year. And then I discovered, oh, she also speaks a little English. But she then, when Sophie retired, she became my assistant and inherited from Sophie these wonderful qualities of dedication and goodness and kindness, and has been a huge support to me. So many, many thanks to Sylvia. You know, over the years, if people have admired my Spanish as I'm preaching, that's all Sylvia. I mean, she helped me with these sermons. And then finally, Noelle Fuentes, there she is. Many of you know Noelle. When I first heard from Archbishop Gomez that I was coming to the Santa Barbara region, I knew almost nothing about it. But I had some little brochure or something that gave names and numbers, right? And on that I took it as Noel Fuentes. And I said, well, I better call this guy and find out what this region is all about. So I called the number and discovered not a guy, but a lovely lady, Noelle Fuentes. And I remember I was sitting in my room at Mundelein Seminary, and I was kind of trepidatious, you know, because brand new assignment, knew nothing about it. And I talked to Noelle, I think, for an hour. And I just asked her all kinds of questions. And she, with such enthusiasm and grace and helpful information, really helped me to make the adjustment of this place. And then she in time became my scheduler. And I've got a kind of a complicated schedule. And I must say, people all over the world say to me, please thank that Noelle. She was so kind in working with me. So those 4 people were of tremendous importance to me. So I want to publicly say thank you to you. You know, the last couple of weeks I've been allowing the memories just kind of wash over me of these 6 years. I told the Archbishop how fast it goes by. It seems like yesterday I got out here. I remember, I see Father Leon over here. One of my earliest pastoral interventions was at Our Lady of the Assumption in Ventura, because I was here a week. I didn't know anybody, didn't know the parishes, knew nothing. But I heard there was a meeting of pastors and principals there. So I got in my car and I went. And I didn't know a soul in the room, but I kind of dutifully listened to everybody. And then at the end, maybe it was Leon or whoever was running the meeting, said, Bishop, would you like to share a few thoughts? So I got up and I said, I want you all to know I really believe in Catholic education. At which point, I'm not a guy usually at loss for words, but at which point I realized I have nothing else to say. I don't know the schools. No. And so then I said, and thank you all for being here. And I sat down and I thought, they must think, who is this idiot who's been sent as our bishop? Another memory I have from the early days, not far from here, Our Lady of Sorrows in Santa Barbara. And it was my sort of welcome mass, and it was in the evening at 7, and there was going to be a reception right afterwards. And I would describe the weather as 69 degrees with a light breeze, right? So the Mass ends, and it must have been Monsignor Rafa at the time. He said, everybody, we're going to go inside for the reception because it's gotten pretty blustery out there. I grabbed the microphone from Chicago. I said, you people have no idea what blustery means. I remember, I told the Archbishop this, I've always had trouble telling jokes in Spanish. So, I mean, I'll speak Spanish, but when I've tried like a little joke or story, I get no reaction. Well, the first time that happened was in Oxnard. It was the Feast of Our Lady Guadalupe. And it was at Our Lady Guadalupe in Oxnard, which is a great church, big church. And it was jammed full of people. I mean, the church, and then outside there were loudspeakers. There were probably over 1,000 people there. So I got up and was dutifully reading my homily in Spanish, kind of nervously in front of this giant crowd. And then I came to this little section that was not a joke, it's like a little amusing story, which I had told before in English and always got a little bit of a laugh. So I finished the story, I look up, and there's 1,000 people in complete silence. I mean, not one reaction. So I remember I said to the Archbishop, what is it? I just can't tell a joke in Spanish. And I told the story, and he said, well, the Spanish is okay, it's just not that funny. So I kind of gave up, you know. I'll tell you one more story about, you know, when you're an auxiliary bishop, you do a lot of confirmations. And I actually loved confirmation season. I went through 7 confirmation seasons here. And I figured I've confirmed about 15,000 people. Isn't that amazing? When you add up the numbers, yeah, I'll take the applause. I enjoyed the season of confirmation, getting around the whole region and seeing these young people, you know, about to make this commitment. It was always a joy for me. But my memory is in the early years when I was trying to engage the kids more, you know, I tried to get them to talk, which, you know, teenagers, it's not really a good idea. But I would ask them, like, okay, who can name one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit? You're going to receive these 7 gifts. Can you name any of them? Nada, you know, I mean, crickets. So I'm at one parish and I did the same thing. You know, can anyone name the gifts of the Holy Spirit? Nothing. How about one? Can you give me one gift? Nada. So I went on with the sermon. Well, I finished the sermon. I turned around. I'm not kidding. In the sanctuary, ceiling to floor banners, each one with a gift of the Holy Spirit. Wisdom, knowledge. I said, kids, read. They're right there, you know. I gave up, though, trying to get the gifts of the Spirit out of them. What a joy seeing the priests here. You've been so good to me. I mean, from the time I arrived. I remember early on, before Deacon Chris was working with me, and Noel would take me around to deanery meetings and so on. And what we would do on the way home is I'd say, okay, who was the priest that right across from me? And the guy next to him? And who's the guy that told the joke? And who was this fella? You know. So she helped me to get to know all of you. But over the years, I came to know you well and came to appreciate what you do for this region. So God bless you guys. Thank you for your support to me. Marvelous. And can I say a special word about the order priests? We are very rich in religious order priests up here in the Santa Barbara region. I think of the Cricks, you know, the canons regular of the Immaculate Conception over in Santa Paula. I think of the Augustinian Recollects and the Missionaries of the Holy Spirit in Oxnard. Think of the Josephites up in Santa Maria, the wonderful Josephites. I just got an email this morning. They're all over in Belgium right now at their international chapter meeting. That's why they can't be here today, but they sent their best to me today. Love working with them. The Capuchins up in San Lorenzo and Santa Ynez. And of course, the wonderful OFM Franciscans here. How can I not pay tribute to them as I stand on the steps of the mission? You know, one of my great memories is of Father John Vaughan. Some of you remember Father John. He was literally the successor of St. Francis. He was the first American ever to be elected, do you call him general or master of the order, the international head of the Franciscans. And I met him just down the road here when he was here toward the end of his life in kind of hospice care, or maybe not quite hospice, but I came to, you know, bring him comfort. Well, he was, you know, when you're in the presence of somebody who's really holy and you just know it, he was like that. And he would always turn the conversation back to me, how I was doing and how he could help me and his prayers for me. And that was a great gift, getting to know him. And I had the privilege, after he died, to inter his remains in the columbarium here. And I remember as I did that thinking, here's the successor of Francis of Assisi. And the good brothers and priests here that I think embody that spirit so well. Just grateful for that. Down the road, the Poor Clares. It was my privilege to say Mass every month for the Poor Clares. Beautiful. I mean, I asked them when I first arrived here, I said, sisters, could you pray for my physical health and my spiritual protection? And they never forgot that. They always said to me, we know, what we're praying for. And just the other day, I said Mass for the last time for them and said, please, those two things, keep praying. So love them and loved all these order priests and sisters that I work with. The army of deacons up here in Santa Barbara. I couldn't get over the number of deacons when I came here. I remember I was at Padre Serra one time, and there were like 4 or 5 deacons. And I said, gosh, how many are there in this parish? And they said, 12. I'd never seen a parish of 12 deacons. But I've come to love the deacons here and know them well. And they came to the summer dinners at my house every summer. It was lovely to get to know them and thank them for their work. So anyway, all these people, everybody, I'm so grateful for. What occurred to me as I was getting ready for these remarks, we've been through a lot together in these last 6 or 7 years, haven't we? Think of what's happened. Long before we wore masks for COVID, do you remember? We wore masks because of the Thomas Fire. The Thomas Fire broke out. I remember it was the day of the Guadalupe procession in Santa Barbara. It was like December 3rd or 4th. We heard about this fire that broke out near Thomas Aquinas College, hence the name. And then it grew and it grew and it grew and it burned all the way down to Ventura. Do you know, on the 101, you can still see those palm trees charred from that fire. And when it reached the ocean, a lot of people thought, okay, it's going to end. It's the ocean's going to stop it. Well, of course, no, it turned north, moved up through Carp and then into Montecito. And I remember the day when I looked out and we could see the cloud approaching and the air was getting so thick, and that's why we put the masks on. But I remember the first time I saw the flames up in the hills. And then they came right here, right behind my house. I remember I was out one morning in front of the house, and it was right nearby, and there were, the flames were every place. And I was on the front lawn of my house, and this gentleman came by who was a retired fire captain. He said, Bishop, what are you still doing here? I said, well, we haven't been told to evacuate. He goes, there are embers flying all over. This whole place could go up in a second. So I grabbed a couple of vestments, I think, and my computer, my laptop, and got in the car. So I was chased out of the house a couple times. I know a lot of you, experienced the Thomas Fire and all that trauma. We got through it somehow, didn't we? Then think of the mudslide. I'll never forget that night when after the month of the fire, and then it rained. And I went to sleep that night thinking, oh, thank God it's raining. Thank God the rains have come and will put that darn fire out. And then I'm looking at Father Lawrence over there. The mudslide came and went right past, your parish. Killed how many? 25, 30 people. That was a terrible blow to our community. And I think people are still deeply affected by that. I remember attending a lot of the funerals in the wake of that tragedy. The 101, remember that was shut down for about 3 weeks. I do have a story from that. So when the 101 was shut down, there was no back and forth, but I had to give a talk at Claremont University. So I got on a plane out here, flew to LAX, made my way up to Claremont somehow, I forget how. Gave a talk, and then I was with the Archbishop for a time, and he said, well, I'm going to go up to your region to say Mass. It was right here at the mission. I said, well, how are you getting up there? And he says, I'm taking a helicopter. And I said, well, do you mind if I join you? Because I hadn't taken my car. So we get in a helicopter, and we start our way up here. And suddenly, the door of the helicopter opened. And I said to the pilot, is that supposed to happen? He goes, it happens all the time, don't worry about it. Well, not to me, it doesn't. So that was a memorable helicopter ride up here. But that was when the Archbishop was gracious enough to come up to pray with our good people in this region. You remember we just had this shooting in my hometown, my home area of Highland Park, Illinois. Remember the shooting we had in Thousand Oaks? That was in 2018 at the borderline. Remember that? It's a place I'd gone to dinner there. Remember the fire down here at the harbor, the Santa Barbara Harbor, when the 35 people died? That was in 2019. And then, of course, COVID, which we all endured together. Again, being outside here reminds me of those days when at all our parishes, we'd have our liturgies and everything outside. One of my enduring memories is way up in Santa Maria when I went up to Louis de Montfort. And it was at the height of COVID when we couldn't gather inside at all. But people were hungry for the Eucharist. So we went up there and I did a benediction service kind of behind barriers and all this. And the people were out, like you, in the parking lot, in their cars, all shut in. They wouldn't open the windows. And when I finished the benediction service, one person honked his horn, and then a second person, and then a third. And before I knew it, all the horns were honking. And it was just their way of saying, praise the Lord, or thank you, or we're still here, or we care about the Lord. And it's just, to me, that's the enduring memory of the COVID period. We got through it, didn't we? I think our faith strengthened. That's my intuition. Our faith strengthened during that terrible time. Can I give you one last memory? It was during that same period, 2020. Remember that terrible summer after the murder of George Floyd and the whole country kind of went up for grabs. And people were threatening the statues. Father Tom Elowat, who gave a great defense of the statue of Sarah in Ventura. Tom emailed me today, he couldn't make it, but he valiantly defended that statue. But it's not ours, it belonged to the city and they took it down. But then I got word, I think it was Father Bobby first told me, that they were threatening the statue at Santa Ynez of Junipero Serra. And I remember I said to the Archbishop, and he agreed, I said, I think we got to draw a line here. You know, this is our property, this is our statue. We can't let them desecrate the statue. So with Father Bobby's help and the Capuchins and the Franciscans and many others, we organized a great day. I came out there for Mass. It was just like this. We had Mass and people were arrayed like you are. Celebrated Mass, and then we surrounded the statue and we prayed the Rosary together. A lot of the Capuchin novices and seminarians came down. It's beautiful. And I remember at that time, there appeared this group, about 4 or 5 of these young men, Hispanic, but wearing kind of Jewish temple garb. And they were carrying the shofar, you know, the big ram's horn. And I turned to Father Bobby and I said, who are these guys? He said, I don't know. I thought, are they on our side or what? I didn't know. So I went up to him and said, you know, who are you? Well, they didn't speak English. They were just, I said, ¿Quiénes son? You know, and they were a group of Catholics, but they believe in the Jewish, you know, roots of Catholicism, and they have the ram's horn. And I said, okay, you're not against us, you're with us, you know. Well, anyway, after we prayed, the protesters came, and with the bull horns and everything. And they started shouting all this, you know, obscene, ridiculous nonsense about Junipero Serra. Well, the Knights on bikes were there. We have some Knights of Columbus here, right, today? The Knights on bikes were there, and as these people were shouting all their obscenities, the Knights went, rum, 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 drowning them out. And then when the Knights got tired, these 5 guys with the shofars, so here's the lady, she's shouting into her bullhorn, and they take the horns, and they're drowning, and I thought, it's the Battle of Jericho, you know? Well, when the protesters finally left, I love this moment. The Capuchins and the Franciscans very sincerely raised their hands and prayed a blessing as they went. Beautiful, it seems to me. It was the right way to defend that statue, the right way to stand for the prerogatives of the church. And may I say, that statue stands unscathed to this day. And that's... I'll tell you why I love that memory so much, because it was everybody coming together. it was Father Bobby, it was the Caps, it was the Franciscans, it was the lay people, it was everybody coming together. It was the guys with the horns, it was the knights on bikes. It's like the whole church rose up and said, we're standing for this great saint. And maybe that's the memory that will stay with me most powerfully, from these years. Can I say, I know you guys are warm out there in the sun. Can I say one quick thing about the gospel? The Good Samaritan. He finally got to the gospel, they're thinking. The Good Samaritan is about Jesus, isn't it? A man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. That's the fall of man. That's all of us. We've lost our fellowship with God. We've gone down from Jerusalem to Jericho, which is near the Dead Sea. It's as low as you can get. He's beaten up. He's robbed. He's left half dead. That's all of us sinners. That's what sin does to us. It robs us of our dignity. It beats us up. It leaves us only half alive. The priest and the Levite go by. They can't save us. That means our efforts can't save us. Or if I get enough, wealth or power or money or prestige or this or that. No. None of that will save us. Who alone can save us? This strange outsider, the Samaritan. Who is he? That's Christ himself, who comes down and joins us in our lowliness and our brokenness, who puts us on his beast of burden. He bears our struggles. More to it, he pours in wine and oil. What's that symbolic of? But the sacramental life of the church. That's baptism and confirmation in the Eucharist. He then brings us to an inn. What's that? But that's the church. Pope Francis calls it a field hospital where the wounded are treated. That's where the church is, everybody. It's where we sinners go to be treated. And then we hear he paid the remaining price. Christ redeemed us. He bought us back. This parable is all about him. It's about him and what he does to save us sinners. But now here's the real payoff for us. Once we take that in, once we know who he is, then we know who we ought to be. We must be Christ for others. What's our task every day is to look for people who are like the man wounded and beaten and half dead by the side of the road. Who's suffering right now? Who's in need right now? And do we respond with love? Do we respond by pouring in wine and oil, bringing them to the field hospital of the church? Do we respond caring for their wounds? That's Christianity, it seems to me. Jesus said, that's how they'll know you're my disciples, by the love you have for each other. All of our meetings and all of our activities and all of our events, all our liturgies, everything is meant to make us more and more people of love. I hope that's what, in all the preaching I've done and all the ministry I've done, I've tried to communicate. Once we know who he is, we know who we are. We take care of each other. We love each other. That's the spirit I hope to bring to Minnesota, where I'm going. The spirit that you very much brought to me during these almost 7 wonderful years. God bless you all. Thanks.